This is where quality content meets creativity. Every video is crafted to give you a better viewing experience. Subscribe and enjoy something different. The morning I realized my daughter had stopped using her own bank account, she was standing in my kitchen asking me if I could spot her $20 for gas. She laughed when she said it. Nervous, small, the kind of laugh that asks you not to look too closely. My daughter, who had bought her first car at 22 with money she saved herself, who had launched her own design business before she turned 25, was asking her mother for $20 and pretending it was funny. I did not laugh with her. I set down my coffee cup, looked at her face, and understood something I had been refusing to understand for almost 2 years. This was not a rough patch. This was a pattern. And I had spent 31 years of my career recognizing exactly this kind of pattern. My name is Gloria, and I am 63 years old. I live in a brick house on a quiet street in Nashville, Tennessee, where the summers feel like standing inside a closed oven and the neighbors still bring food when someone is sick. I retired 4 years ago from a career in forensic accounting. For 3 decades, I followed money. I traced it through false invoices and shell companies and accounts that existed only on paper. I found what people tried to hide. I found the truth embedded in numbers when words failed to tell it. I was good at my work because I understood one fundamental thing. People who want control always follow the money first. Always. I never thought I would need that skill in my own family. I never thought I would sit across a kitchen table from my own daughter and see the signature of financial abuse written clearly in the way she flinched when she mentioned her husband's name. My daughter had always been the kind of woman who filled every room she walked into. Not loudly, not recklessly, but with a particular quality of presence that made people lean toward her. She had her father's eyes and my stubbornness, which I always considered a gift even when it exasperated me. Growing up, she rearranged her bedroom furniture every 3 months because she believed the way a room felt changed how a person thought. At 17, she redecorated the living room while I was at a conference, and I came home to find she had somehow made the space twice as large without moving a single wall. She had a talent for seeing what others missed. When she started her interior design business, she worked 16-hour days and never once complained. She built her client list by sheer force of quality and personality. She had a gift for listening to what people said they wanted and hearing what they actually needed. Her business was 3 years old when she met her husband at a charity auction in Memphis. He was standing near a painting she had helped source for the event. He asked her questions about the piece, with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He was attentive in a way that felt rare. She called me that same evening, voice bright, in a way I had not heard since before her father passed. He seemed like so many things she deserved. He was charming in the particular way of men who have been taught that charm is a tool. He came from a family with old Tennessee money, and the kind of confidence that old money tends to produce. His mother hosted dinners where the china matched, and the conversation stayed above a certain altitude. His father was quiet and agreeable in the way that men become when someone else has always decided things for them. I noticed that early. I filed it away without knowing yet why it mattered. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that looks perfect from the outside. A renovated house in a good neighborhood. Dinner parties. Photographs that made everything look curated and deliberate. My daughter still called me regularly then. She still talked about her clients, her ideas, her frustrations with suppliers who did not understand her vision. She was still herself. Then the suggestions began. He thought her business hours were a little much. Did she really need to take Saturday clients? It was affecting their time together. He thought some of her clients were not quite the right fit for where they were headed socially. He thought her studio space, the one she had rented and decorated herself, was maybe more than she needed right now. He said it all with reasonable voices and reasonable faces. He said it in the language of concern, the language of someone who only wanted what was best for her. Each sentence landed like a pebble dropped into still water, small, barely audible, but the ripples spread. His mother reinforced every word. She had a particular gift for saying cutting things in tones so gentle you questioned whether you had heard them correctly. She would take my daughter's hand at Sunday dinners and say things like, "A woman who runs too hard loses what matters most," or, "My son has a certain position to maintain, and the wives of men like him serve a different kind of purpose." She said these things over sweet tea with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She said them as though she were passing down wisdom rather than instructions. I told myself my daughter was an adult. I told myself she knew her own mind. I told myself that a controlling mother-in-law was not uncommon, and my daughter was strong enough to handle it. I was telling myself a great many things to avoid seeing what was directly in front of me. By the time I began to see it clearly, 2 years had passed. My daughter's client list had quietly shrunk. She had given up the Saturday appointments. The studio space was gone. She worked from a small room in their house that her husband had selected for her, with a door that did not lock. She no longer attended her design industry events alone. When I asked about a project she had mentioned months earlier, the one she had been excited about, she said it had not worked out, and moved quickly to another subject. Her sentences had grown shorter. Not abrupt, just contained, edited. She paused before answering questions, in a way she never had before, a half-second delay that told me she was calculating before she spoke. She wore her hair differently, pulled back and neat, the way his mother wore hers. Small things, the kind of small things that only register when you have been trained to notice what does not add up. The $20 for gas was the morning everything came into focus. After she left that day, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I thought about it the way I used to think about accounts that did not balance. I thought about what I knew and what I did not know, and what the gap between those two things was likely to contain. My daughter had owned a thriving small business with its own revenue stream. She had a personal checking account she had maintained since college. She owned a car outright. She had savings. None of that disappears naturally. None of that evaporates on its own. It moves. It gets redirected. And someone decides where it goes. I started quietly. I did not tell my daughter what I was doing because I had learned over 3 decades that when people know they are being investigated, evidence has a way of disappearing along with the truth. I called an old colleague, a woman I had worked with for 15 years who now consulted independently, and I asked her to help me look at some things. I asked my daughter small questions on our weekly calls, the kind of questions that sounded like ordinary conversation about the house, about expenses, about whether they had done anything with her studio space. I listened not just to the answers, but to the architecture of the answers, where she hesitated, where she moved on too quickly, what she did not say. What I found over the next 3 weeks rearranged everything I thought I understood. My daughter's personal account had been moved to a joint account 14 months into their marriage. That was not unusual on its own. Couples combined finances, but the access structure of that joint account was not equal. My daughter could view the balance and make purchases below a certain threshold. Large withdrawals, transfers, investment decisions, all required his approval. Her business income, which had been deposited into her own account for 3 years, was now deposited into a household account she did not have independent access to. The business itself had been quietly restructured. The operating agreement had been amended to add him as a partner who, by the terms of the amendment, held final authority over major decisions. None of this was hidden. It was all legal. It was all documented. That was the sophistication of it. Every piece had a reasonable explanation sitting on top of it like a lid on a jar. Couples combined finances. Spouses became business partners. These things happened every day without malice. The malice was in the pattern, in the sequence, in the way each individual reasonable-sounding step had locked another door behind my daughter until the room she was standing in had no exits she could see. I was good at finding patterns. This one made my hands go cold. I went to see my daughter on a Tuesday, unannounced, something I had stopped doing because she had gently suggested it was better if I called ahead. He preferred advance notice of guests. I drove to their house and knocked on the door, and when she opened it and saw me standing there with no warning, I watched something move through her face. Relief, then fear, then the careful rearrangement of her features into something composed and welcoming. We sat on her back porch. She brought iced tea. For a while we talked about nothing: the neighborhood, a client she had taken on recently, a movie she had watched. I listened to all of it, and then I set down my glass, and I said her name the way I had said it when she was small, and something was wrong. She stopped talking. I did not accuse. I did not present evidence. I had learned in my career that confronting someone with conclusions before they are ready to hear them produces only denial. Instead, I asked her one question. I asked her the last time she had made a financial decision completely on her own, without discussion, without approval, without telling anyone where the money went. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the table. Then she said quietly that things were just different now. That marriage meant compromise, that he had a lot on his plate, and it was easier if he managed the bigger picture. She said it quickly, the way people recite things they have practiced. I said, "That sounds like something someone taught you to believe." She did not answer for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glassy, and she said very softly that sometimes she felt like she was living in a house where all the lights worked, but she could not remember where any of the switches were. That sentence broke something open in me, and I did not let her see it. I kept my face steady. I had learned a long time ago that when someone is finally letting themselves feel something true, the worst thing you can do is react in a way that makes them feel responsible for your reaction. So I breathed. I nodded. I stayed. She told me things that afternoon she had not said out loud before. How he reviewed her phone on Sunday evenings. Not dramatically, not as an argument, just casually, reaching over and scrolling while she sat beside him, as though this were ordinary. How the client she had taken on recently was the first one she had brought in without his approval in over a year, and how she had not yet told him because she was waiting to find the right moment. How the right moment never seemed to arrive. How she had started saving small amounts of cash, 10s and 20s, in an envelope behind her winter coats, because she wanted to have something that was hers, and she was not entirely sure why that felt so necessary. The envelope behind the winter coats told me more than any financial document. People do not hide money in their own homes unless they are afraid of something. She knew what was happening to her. She had known for a while. She had just been working very hard not to know it fully, because fully knowing it meant fully deciding, and she was not ready to carry that weight yet. I drove home that evening, and I made a list, not of what I felt, of what I knew, of what I needed to find out, of what I needed to document before anything moved. And that night I started making calls. They found out something was happening before I was finished. People like him always do. There is a particular sensitivity that develops in people who have built their lives on controlling information. They feel the shift in air pressure when something changes. The first sign was that he called me. Friendly, warm, the way he always was with me, asking how I was doing, mentioning that my daughter had seemed a little off lately and he was worried about her. He said he thought she might be letting her mother's influence create unnecessary anxiety. He said he had always respected me, but he hoped I understood that a marriage was a private thing, and outside voices, even loving ones, could sometimes do more harm than good. He laughed when he said it. Easy, relaxed, the laugh of a man who believes he is managing a situation. I thanked him for calling. I told him I appreciated his concern. I said nothing else. His mother called me 2 days later. She was less diplomatic. She told me that I had raised a daughter who struggled with gratitude. She told me that her son had given my daughter a life she could not have built for herself. She told me that some women needed structure, and the women who fought against it usually ended up alone. She said all of this in her particular tone, gracious and lethal in equal measure, the tone of someone who had spent decades saying cruel things beautifully. I listened to every word. I did not respond to the content of any of it. I said I appreciated her perspective, and I hoped she had a lovely evening. Then I ended the call, and I sat for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen, because I had recognized something in her voice that I had not expected. Not just control, familiarity, the ease of someone who has done this before. Many times. The particular fluency of someone who has not only lived inside a system like this but built one. That recognition sent me back to my research with a different question. My colleague found it 3 days later. Not in recent records, but in older ones, court documents from 18 years ago. A civil case involving the estate of his paternal grandfather. A dispute over a business that had been transferred out of the grandfather's name in the final 2 years of his life. A pattern of signatures on documents. Amendments to operating agreements. Consolidation of financial control. The grandfather had been in his 80s, in declining health, and by the time he died, the assets he had intended to distribute broadly were held in structures that funneled almost entirely to one branch of the family. The case had been settled quietly. The settlement terms were sealed. This had not begun with my daughter. This was not a man who had developed controlling habits in marriage. This was a family that had refined these habits across generations. His mother had not invented the system she was running. She had inherited it and improved it. Every woman who had married into that family had encountered some version of the same architecture. Financial dependency first. Isolation second. Redefinition of the woman's own judgment as unreliable. And then the patient, methodical transfer of everything she had brought into the marriage. My daughter was not the first. She might have been the last, if I had not started looking. I called my daughter on a Thursday morning and asked her to come to my house. I asked her to come alone and to tell no one she was coming. She arrived 40 minutes later, looking as though she had not slept. She sat at my kitchen table in the same chair she had sat in since she was a child, and I made coffee, and then I placed a folder in front of her, and I told her to take as long as she needed. She was quiet for a long time. I watched her read. I watched the color leave her face and then return in a different form. Not fear this time, but something harder and cleaner. Recognition. The particular relief of a person who has been gaslit for years, finally finding the document that confirms what they already knew in their body but could not yet speak. She closed the folder. She put both hands flat on the table. She said, "How long?" I told her what I knew. I told her about the account structures, the business amendments, the historical pattern. I did not soften it. I had learned that people who have survived years of having their perceptions quietly invalidated need to hear truth spoken directly, without cushion, so they can trust their own understanding of it. She asked me why I had not told her sooner. I told her I had needed time to document it properly, and that documentation was the difference between a story someone could dismiss and a record someone had to answer to. She nodded slowly. She understood that. She was her mother's daughter. Then she was quiet again for a while, and I let her be quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. Ordinary morning sounds. The kind of sounds that keep playing while your life rearranges itself around a new understanding. She said, "I kept thinking I was overreacting." I said, That is what the system is designed to make you think. She said, I have an envelope behind my winter coats. I said, I know. I told her the envelope was smart. I told her it was her instincts telling her the truth when everything around her was telling her something else. She had known. Some part of her had always known. The system had only been strong enough to keep that knowledge from reaching the surface. She cried then, not dramatically, quietly, the way people cry when the grief is old, when it has been held in a small space for a long time and finally has room to breathe. I sat with her, and I did not tell her it was going to be fine. I did not know that yet. What I knew was that she was sitting at my kitchen table with her hands flat on solid wood and her eyes open, and that was a different place than she had been standing in for 2 years. That was enough for now. What happened next did not happen quickly, and I want to be honest about that, because the stories that end in 3 clean steps are not the stories that actually help people. Real disentanglement from a system like this takes time and careful movement, and the willingness to stay steady when the pressure comes back hard. And it came back hard. When my daughter told her husband she was separating, he did what people do when control begins to slip. He escalated, not with violence, not with shouting, with pressure. He told her she was confused. He told her I had manipulated her. He called her closest friend and told her I was unstable and had been interfering with their marriage for years. He had his attorney send a letter suggesting that the business amendment gave him rights to assets she believed were hers, and that any dissolution of the marriage would need to account for that partnership. It was a letter designed to make her feel trapped, to make the cost of leaving feel too high to pay. His mother went to work on social channels, careful, indirect, the kind of campaign that plants questions without stating accusations. She made comments at a church function that found their way back to people my daughter knew professionally. She suggested to certain mutual acquaintances that my daughter was going through something difficult, that she had always been a little unstable, that it was sad what grief could do to a family. I had seen this before, too. Not in marriages, but in boardrooms. The way institutions protect themselves when someone starts asking the right questions. Attack the source. Make the truth teller the story. I did not respond. I documented everything. Every letter, every message, every second-hand account. I stayed in contact with my old colleague. I consulted a family attorney who specialized in financial abuse cases. I brought her the same folder I had shown my daughter and watched the attorney's expression change as she read. The business amendment, it turned out, had a significant problem. It had been executed during a period when my daughter's attorney of record, the one who should have reviewed it, had been on leave. The substitute who signed off had done so without conducting a proper review. The amendment was not necessarily enforceable. The account structures had other problems. There were transfers that had not been properly disclosed. There was a pattern that, seen clearly, looked less like financial management and more like financial control. The attorney used a specific term: economic abuse. She said it plainly, the way my colleague said things plainly, with the particular matter-of-factness of someone who has seen this enough times to call it by its name. My daughter filed for divorce 7 weeks after she sat at my kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood. It was not clean, and it was not fast, and there were days she called me at midnight unsure whether she could keep going. There were days she doubted herself again, felt the old familiar pull of the voice that said maybe she was overreacting, maybe she was ungrateful, maybe she was the problem. Those days were hard. I stayed on the phone. I did not tell her what to feel. I told her what I knew. I told her what the documents said. I told her what the pattern showed. I gave her back the truth every time the pressure tried to take it from her again. The divorce was finalized 11 months later. The business amendment was challenged and largely invalidated. The account structures were unwound. My daughter walked out of that marriage with her business, her name, and her financial independence intact. Not without cost, not without loss, but intact. His mother tried one final intervention 3 days before the settlement was signed. She called me directly and told me I had destroyed a good marriage and a good family and that I would answer for it eventually. She said it with that same gracious lethality, the voice of someone accustomed to having the last word. I said, I have been documenting this conversation. I told her I had documentation going back 26 months. I told her about the civil case from 18 years ago. I said her name once, clearly, and told her I hoped she understood what I meant when I said that I knew the pattern did not start with her son. The line was quiet for a long time. Then she ended the call. 3 years have passed since that morning in my kitchen with the $20 and the nervous laugh. My daughter lives in a small house she chose herself, with rooms she designed without asking anyone's permission. She painted the kitchen a shade of yellow that her ex-husband would have called impractical. She left it exactly that shade. She went back to taking Saturday clients. She reopened her studio. Last spring, she was asked to consult on a commercial development in East Nashville, and she called me the night she got the email, voice bright in a way I had not heard for a long time. She is seeing someone now. Slowly, carefully, on her own terms. A man who asks about her work with the kind of curiosity that does not have an agenda underneath it. A man who, when she disagreed with him last fall at dinner about something minor, listened to her reasoning and said, "You know, I think you might be right." She called me after that dinner, too. It was the specific way she said it. Not that he was perfect, but that he had made room for her to be right, that told me what I needed to know. As for me, I have been thinking about this story for 3 years, about whether to write it, about who it was for. I decided it was not for the people who had everything figured out. It was for the mothers who sense something, but cannot name it. For the women who are standing in a room where all the lights work, but they have forgotten where the switches are. For anyone who has been made to feel that their own understanding of their own life is not to be trusted. So before I go, I want to leave you with 5 things this experience taught me. The first is that financial control is one of the earliest and quietest forms of abuse, and it almost never announces itself as abuse. It arrives as practicality, as partnership, as one person being better with numbers. By the time it is complete, the person inside it often cannot see it because the architecture has been built slowly enough to feel like ordinary life. The second is that the people who build these systems are often skilled at them because they learned from someone else. This is a pattern that moves through families. Understanding that does not excuse anything, but it explains why the behavior is often so sophisticated, so prepared, so hard to name. Someone taught them, they learned. The third is that instinct is not nothing. My daughter had hidden that envelope behind her winter coats before she could fully name what she was afraid of. Her body knew the truth before her mind was ready to say it. When something in you says, "Save this, remember this, keep a copy, keep cash," trust that voice. It knows more than you are giving it credit for. The fourth is that documentation is protection. It is not paranoia. It is the difference between a feeling and a record. When truth is spoken, it can be dismissed. When truth is documented, it has to be answered. And the fifth is this. Loving someone does not mean becoming invisible to yourself. Compromise is not the same as disappearance. A person who loves you does not need to hold the keys to your life to feel secure. Love that requires your shrinking is not love. It is something else wearing love's name. If any part of this story sounded familiar to you, I want you to know that you are not imagining it. You are not overreacting. You are not the problem. What lesson did you take from this story? And what city are you watching from? If you believe stories like this matter, share it. Leave a comment below. Your voice might be the one that helps someone else find theirs.